So welcome everybody to our forum on accessibility. Welcome also to our folks online. So our first presenter is, Kailha Winter-Smith, who is the Assistive Technologist at the University of New Brunswick. Before working at UNB, she worked at the Neil Squire Society for 4 years as an Assistive Technology and Learning Disability Specialist. She holds a BA in Disability Studies with postgraduate studies as an Applied Learning Disability Specialist with the focus on assistive technology and learning strategies. So please, everyone, welcome Kailha to kick off our forum on accessibility. Kailha, over to you.
Hi, thank you very much for the welcome. I'm really looking forward to presenting to everybody today, and hopefully you enjoy what I have to present. There'll be time for questions at the end, but if you have any questions throughout, please feel free to ask. And this is the first time me using Skype to present, so if there's glitches here and there, bear with me, but I think I have the hang of it. So today I'm going to be talking about accessibility, technology, and the changing landscape. So I'm going to talk about several topics that I'll explain in a minute. Really, it's only touching on the beginning of a lot of these topics. Many of these things where, you can dive more deep and look into it even more, but it's just to really start opening our mind into accessibility and really what does that mean. So the topics that I'm going to talk about today are: what does accessibility mean? Who and what are the specific target groups? Acts and treaties, technology, assistive technology and libraries, and then what you can do. What does that mean? It is important to understand the root of the meaning first, so really understanding what accessibility means.
Are you there, Kailha?
I'm still here.
Okay, sorry, we sort of lost you a second there.
Oh, that's okay. So what's really important when we're looking at accessibility. So when you look at yes?
So your voice keeps dropping out every once in a while. So I'm wondering if for the audio portion you might want to phone in. Do you have the access info?
Yes, I do.
Apologies for that. It's just for some reason it's slow today.
Okay, so just
it's more here in the room.
Okay.
Oh, so nobody online is having problems. So we're okay there.
Nobody online, it's just in the room. Okay.
Yeah,
so
okay.
Do you still want me to?
No, just keep going.
Okay. I'll try it. I'll slow down, and then hopefully that'll help with that. So when looking at the definition, the phrases that come up with accessibility is capable of being reached, capable of being used, and capable of being understood. So when we're looking at accessibility, it's really looking at the access of that and the ability to have access of different things, whether it's a physical space, a virtual space, wherever that is. And we quite often think about accessibility as something physical to gain access to, but it's more than that. Like I said, it's not just physical, it's looking at the whole picture, so whether virtually or going into a physical space. And I think it's really, really good and important to understand is that everybody's going to look at accessibility differently, and that's okay, but it's just understanding it's really the access to something. Okay, so the next slide that I want to look at is the accessibility and what does that mean for libraries specifically. So when looking at specific access to a library and the services which it provides, we really need to dive into and look at every part of it. Accessibility in libraries is more than just about getting access to the building. It is also about accessing the services, the materials, the workstation, the areas, and navigating the virtual spaces. We can break it down to as simple as getting through the door, from retrieving a book, accessing a workstation, looking at something up on a computer, and being able to read information. I mean, I can keep going with that list, but it's really important to look at every individual task that somebody would be able to in order to access that space. I really want to continue to look at that space, but I want to focus on looking at a virtual space as it's evolved. So many years ago, that wasn't even part of the library. There was no virtual space. So this has evolved into people accessing library resources and services virtually and online. So not physically coming in or walking into the doors. So we need to think about that space and how someone is going to access it. Making sure that websites and online services are accessible, and understanding how different people access those spaces. So when we're thinking about individuals and accessing those virtual spaces, many of those individuals are going to be using specialized programs that might read information out loud that they have to use in order to manipulate the space, so they have to use their voice. And it's really thinking about how they're accessing that space and whether or not they can with those programs. So we really have to look outside the box when we're thinking about the virtual space, because there's so many entities when we're thinking about it. And later on, I'm going to dive more into that online space. Oh, sorry. Went ahead of myself. So resources and services. So when we're thinking about accessibility in the libraries, we want to think about the resources and services. So knowing where the services are within the library, and the physical and the virtual library. As well, knowing how to navigate through it. So if we're trying to navigate it through the physical and or the virtual space, it's really important to think about those things. And the first part that I think about is the individuals that, so when somebody's coming in to access services within the library, is the people working at the front desk, the ones that interact with the students or the individuals who access those spaces. So knowing and understanding where the students, individuals can go for specific services is really important. And the biggest thing that I like to explain is that you don't need to be an expert in knowing how the services work, but just knowing where they can get those services, whether it's specifically within the library or looking beyond and services within the campus or the community that the library is situated. And there's experts that are in those fields to be able to support those individuals that will be helping those people access that space. So if we use an example is, knowing where those specific accessibility stations are, knowing where specific computer stations are, or even just knowing where to go if we're just looking for a specific set of information within the library. As well, when we're thinking about resources and services, we want to make sure we're keeping up to date on any new and updated services that are happening within the library. And keeping up to date is sometimes hard to do, and we're not always going to be able to do it, but just knowing any new things that are coming on the horizon within your library. So if there's any new services to support people with different abilities, knowing and understanding where and how those services can be accessed. And it's just about being open to asking questions, really. And I always also like to think out, when we think of resources and services, it's not just about resources and services for the individuals coming into the library to access the information, whether it's physically or virtually. We also need to think about the staff and making sure that the staff and the services and supports are there for them so they can have the accessibility that they need in order to work and to support those students as well. And just knowing where to go and knowing where to ask questions around that is really important. There's a lot of great individuals that work within libraries that have a lot of this knowledge that will be there to support you. So as a staff member, I think it's also important to make sure that you have the access and the accessibility to be able to support the individuals, but also support yourself. With the virtual space, it's looking at making it simple to find those services and supports and making it accessible for those individuals that are accessing it. And I know a lot of times when accessing virtual spaces and websites, it sometimes becomes more difficult to making it as simple as possible because we want to make sure all those things are there online for those individuals to access in whatever manner that they need to. Virtual space is ever changing, and there's a lot of supports and features out there that will be able to help make it more accessible, which I'm going to talk about in a couple more slides. And I think in order to truly understand accessibility and how we can access the space, whether physically or virtually, we need to know the individual and their barriers. And knowing that individual and what barriers that they may have will help us understand how they can access that space. The next part is I want to speak on is the specific target groups that one would encounter when going into and accessing a library. So the individuals that will be accessing the library. The target groups of individuals that you'd be serving in a library is changing and evolving every day. And it's really important to understand and know who and what population of people and students who could want to have access to the environment, whether it's physical or virtual. And these specific groups, within these groups, there's even more subtitles and more into it. But this kind of looks at the groups as a broad, and that way we can understand maybe what type of individuals will be accessing these services. So if we look at the individual target groups, we're going to look at 6 of them. So vision, hearing, neurodiversity, learning, mobility, and mental health. And if we look at some of these target groups, we've understood and seen them for a long time, but some of these are not that they're new, it's just they're new in the sense of the understanding of their needs and the services that in order for them to access it. And I'm going to talk more about them individually. And with the great part is now with the evolution of technology and assistive technology, we now know that there are options for these groups to access some of these spaces that maybe wouldn't been able to in the past. So when we're thinking about it, we need to understand who these target groups are. So if we're thinking of vision, visual impairment is defined as decreased ability to see to a degree that causes problems. So it may be a vision issue where they wear glasses, so they need things that a little bit bigger, or maybe they don't have any vision at all or very minimal. But with each person, it's going to be different. We can't just have one definition or one example. Every person with struggle with vision is going to have it differently, and that's something we need to understand. Same thing when we're thinking about individuals with hearing. Everybody's going to have a different varying of their needs when it comes to hearing, and that's important to understand as well. So it could be as simple as they've lost their hearing because of an accident, or maybe they were born with the hearing loss. there's different variances, and it's good to be open and understand that they're not all going to be the same. Neurodiversity. So this is a new word. It's come out more and more the past so many years, and basically the concept is that humans don't come in a one-size-fits-all neurologically normal package, and that's why the term neurodiversity has come up. So instead, it recognizes that all variations of human neurological function need to be respected as it's not just another way of being, that neurological differences like autism and ADHD are the result of a normal, natural variations in the human genome. So neurodiversity is just meaning that everybody is different and nobody fits in one specific part. And I think neurodiversity is a really good word to use when explaining that. And I think it can explain more than just that area as well. Learning disabilities, it refers to a number of disorders. So with learning disabilities, there's many things underneath it, but it could affect acquisition, organization, retention, understanding, or use of verbal, nonverbal information. So I see there's a question. So an example of neurodiversity would be somebody with autism. Does that answer your question, Terry? Yes. So that's what would be neurodiversity. So learning disability, many of you, learning disabilities is one of those things that we're starting to see more and more, but to understand more about learning disabilities, there's a lot of great websites, and with a lot of these specific targets groups that I'm talking about, there are websites. So Learning Disability Association of whether it's Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, PEI, Newfoundland, Learning Disability Association of Canada's website, they do talk about going into more in depth about learning disabilities. Mobility, so affecting somebody physically accessing a space. And then finally, if we're looking at mental health, so mental health has been a growing thing that we've seen within the schools as well as just every day. So mental health could include our emotional, psychological, and social well-being. It affects how we think and act, but it also helps determine how we handle stress, relate to others, and make choices. Mental health is important every stage of life. No, Robin, definitely, you make a very good point. So mental health issues can blur into neurodiversity, and you're exactly right. Neurodiversity, mental health can definitely come back and forth together, especially with PTSD. So thank you for that. So mental health is one of those things that could affect somebody at any point, any of these disabilities. So although mental health is its own category, we need to realize that mental health could affect anybody at any point in their life, depending on their situation, and just understanding that. So the biggest thing that I want to focus on, kind of thinking about these target groups, is that we want to understand how we can support these individuals. And one thing that can be done is to start, go to the websites and see how we can better support these individuals by understanding what it's about. So the best way to understand is either connect with the person who lives with it every day, or connect with an agency who specializes in supporting these individuals. And I think I go back to that because as somebody With a learning disability myself, I know I get asked, you know, what would make it more accessible for you to access a specific place or a piece of material. And I think we could definitely use these specialized agencies to help support the libraries in making sure that things are accessible, whether we're connecting with an individual that's an expert or an agency to help support that. So I think that's just really important to think about those things. So looking at the physical and virtual space, thinking about the specific tasks that that person's trying to access. And once we understand their specific task and barrier within these, we can start looking at how these spaces can truly be accessible and or universally designed. The only person that will really know if the space is accessible is the person who needs to access that space. So I think that's a really good way to end that, is looking at the physical person that wants to access that space and understanding what they need access to. Okay. Is everybody seeing my slides okay? Is there any issues going on?
Some folks are having issues, so I'm working on getting them sent to them.
Okay, no problem. So the next, I want to talk about two specific acts and treaties that I think are really important in understanding the access to specifically materials and the physical space of libraries and services. And it was really interesting when really diving into these both acts and treaties and understanding how they can really, they're going to support individuals and libraries to make it even more accessible for individuals that are accessing it. So the first treaty that I want to talk about, our first act or important documentation, is the Marrakesh Treaty. And the Marrakesh Treaty, so more than 800,000 Canadians live with visual impairment, and around 3 million Canadians are print disabled, which means that they have an impairment related to comprehension or the inability to hold or manipulate a book. And so if you look at those numbers, that's quite significant when we think about it. So the Marrakesh Treaty aims to bring the global community together to better address the universal challenge of ensuring timely access to and the wider availability of printed material for those with visual impairment and other print disabilities. So this is bringing the global community, so not just specifically to us in Atlantic Canada, but looking at a bigger picture. It sets international standards on certain exceptions to copyright so that print materials can be adapted into formats such as Braille and audiobooks. That people with disabilities can use the treaty also, and it makes it possible to distribute accessible formats, copies between countries. The treaty also makes it possible to distribute accessible format copies between countries. So it's not just specific to one place, you can actually go between countries. And a connection with that treaty. So this treaty is really going to specifically open up as more and more, as somebody who's an assistive technologist working at the Accessibility Center at University of New Brunswick, we're seeing more and more that these accessibility texts are need, so the e-texts are need. They need accessible text to be able to read their information, whether it's through a screen reader or they need a bigger font, or they need, like, there's different things that the individuals need. So having this to help standardize and help to encourage that is really important. So within Canada, so the bill in Canada, so Bill C-11, which Canada, the government introduced. It's to amend the Copyright Act and access to copyright works and other subject materials for persons with disabilities. So that was on March 24, 2016. So BC 11 was adopted by both the House of Commons and the Senate, and everything was finalized June 22nd, 2016. So basically, that contains exceptions to allow for making distribution of accessible formatted copies for the benefit of persons with disabilities. So making sure that there's fully in line with the Marrakesh Treaty. So the bill did their amendment. They wanted to make sure that in Canada that everything was following that Marrakesh Treaty, and making sure that people going to schools have access to those documents. But what's really important to understand that it's not just students. So these measures will bring benefits to different individuals as well. So students, workers, seniors, Canadians from minority language groups, schools, libraries, charitable organizations. So basically anybody that needs accessible documentation to read their materials, they want to make sure that that's possible. So Bill C-11 helps with that. The bill also includes the important safeguards to ensure that the legitimate interests of the authors and publishers are respected. So they also want to make sure that the people that are accessing the information, that their rights are respected as well. So it's not just, you can't just go online and get a digital e-text. You do have to request it in the appropriate format. And just on the top, so I've connected, there's two links there that go into the Marrakesh Treaty, as well as the Marrakesh Treaty connected to the bill within Canada. So I'm just going to click and open up so you can see. I'm going to move that over. So the first slide, it should open up and you should be able to see it. So that's the Government of Canada website, and it goes into detail the background of the Marrakesh Treaty and the connection that it has, and kind of explaining how Bill C-11 has been changed and adapted to make sure that it covers what it needs and follows what the treaty is instating. I'll make sure that you guys have access to this as well. Okay, so the second act that I want to talk about is the Nova Scotia Accessibility Act. So Nova Scotia becomes the third Canadian province to enact a comprehensive accessibility law. So the purpose of the act is to achieve accessibility by preventing and removing barriers that disable people with respect to the delivery and the receipt of goods and services, information communication, the built environment, education, and there's also public transportation, employment, and prescribed activity undertaking, and then providing for involvement of persons with disabilities in the public sector and other stakeholders in the development of accessibility standards. So this is a great thing to see, because Nova Scotia is now, stepping up and wanting to make sure not only just in specifically, access to information, but overall having this Accessibility Act so that, all barriers can be removed. They're looking at that the standards with the goal of achieving an accessible Nova Scotia by 2030. So I hope to see that, this happens and continues to support so that people with disabilities have access to what they need, whether it be school, employment, but specifically looking at making sure that those individuals, the accessibility of, libraries and education. And I think this is going to help with knowing that the Accessibility Act has come into play for Nova Scotia, I think it'll really help with institutions in continuing to adapt to making it so that all individuals can access the services within the library. Oh, you should be seeing the slides. Is the slide back up?
No, we're still seeing the website. It's still scrolling through the website, I guess.
Oh, okay. Just a
it...
second. I will close it out, and then that way. Okay.
Well, some people are seeing the slide and some are not, so it might be just.
Okay. I just exited out the website completely so that it'll clear it.
Okay. There we go. It's come back.
Perfect. Okay. So the next part that I want to touch upon is technology and assistive technology. So when we're looking at technology and assistive technology, there's so many things that we can look at. So later on in your presentation, there's going to be a presentation from Charles Levasseur on Microsoft Windows and Office. And he's going to go more into depth into these programs. But what I wanted to really focus on and talk about is that there's a lot of accessibility features and programs and services available within the technology that doesn't have to be purchased, that can be accessed to not only the students but as well the staff within the organization in the libraries. So Microsoft Windows 10 and Office 365, they've now enhanced their accessibility features. So many of the things that we normally would have had to buy programs for, like voice to text, text to speech, even looking at other features, now are available through the Microsoft platform, which is fantastic to see because so many students and as well as people working within the organizations can't always or not able to get those programs, and now really they can be accessible on any computer. So the two links here, I'm not going to open them up, but they just go into detail Microsoft. Microsoft does a really good job at explaining accessibility and going into each area, so those target groups that I talked about earlier, and they really go into detail of what Microsoft can offer to support them. As well, they do offer training and tutorials around how to make PowerPoints accessible, how to make a document accessible for somebody. So if you're having to do presentations or meeting with somebody, you can go into these Microsoft websites and they will actually help you make it so that it is accessible. And we can't forget about Apple accessibility either. So Apple accessibility, so MacBooks, iPads, iPods, iPhones, there is so many accessibility features, and I know we're not talking about it today, but Apple has a lot of fantastic features to support students not only within the library when you walk in, but virtually as well. And just to talk about an example, so if you have an Apple iPhone and you usually use something to read your text out loud, but you're just wanting to look for a book and you're not sure if that's the right one because you're not able to read what the title is or maybe the introduction. There's an app called Prismo Go, P-R-I-Z-M-O Go. You can put on your phone, it's free, or your iPod or your iPad, and it takes a picture of the text and then it reads out loud to you. So that's, you're able to access that physical space. And then Apple itself has voice to text, text to speech, and then other accessibility features to also support vision, hearing, color contrast. And it's just really fantastic to see that Microsoft and Apple are really stepping up to the plate and helping it so that accessibility is available to the mainstream and is available to individuals who can, walk into library or go online and be able to access those tools. And a lot of it's pretty straightforward, and the great thing is that Microsoft as well as Apple will have step-by-step on how to use it as well. So what can you do, or what you can do? So my biggest thing is, as an assistive technology person, when I'm thinking about technology, is I'm always looking for opportunities for more training, courses, online webinars, and workshops. But you, as well as people that are working within the library, working with the individuals, can do that. And there's so many free online courses and webinars out there that are short and easy to just go through and just get yourself a little bit more familiar with some of the technologies that are out there. Connecting with your assistive technologist at your institution, if there is one. If there is not one, connect with another institution and build bridges of support. That's the great thing about, these forums, is building bridges and connecting with other people. Well, connect with, those other individuals at other universities if maybe you don't have have an assistive technologist or somebody that's an expert in something, connect somewhere else. But you also have outside agencies that can support you with disability through assistive technology. So Neil Squire Society, which Charles Levasseur will talk about probably later today, they have an AT help desk that's available in New Brunswick, and you can go online and anybody can access the online, as well as Nova Scotia, PEI, and Newfoundland. So Neil Squire Society would be a great outside agency to help support the technology side if you didn't have those services within your school. And the biggest thing is ask questions. Many times the person who requires the support are the best person to. So I want to thank everybody for listening to what I had to say today. And if there's any questions about anything that I talked about, please feel free to ask. And I'd love to expand. Oh, you lost. Okay. Do you know where I last left off? And then I can just kind of go from there.
It was only for about a few minutes. Is that the Neil Squire when you were talking?
The Neil Squire? Okay. So basically after that, I just went on about just asking questions and talking about the specific person who requires the support, or a lot of times the best person to answer the question on what they need to be able to access the information. And then I just thanked everybody for listening to my presentation, that if anybody had any questions, I was open to any questions that anybody wanted to ask.
So folks, you're muted by default, so if you want to ask a question audio, just unmute. Otherwise, you can ask in the chat box to the left. Okay, so Corinne has a question in the chat.
Okay, I see. Where did you study disability studies, and can you suggest recommended training programs? So the disability studies program that I took was through Ryerson University in Toronto. And training programs. So there's many different trainings. So if you want to further your education on assistive technology and technology, so if you want to go back to school, the Cambrian college course online, you can apply learning disability specialist, so you can specialize, you can choose one stream, you can learn about assistive technology, and it's all online, as well as CSUN does a technology course, but there's also a lot of free ones. So if you go to the specific websites like Read and Write, Inspirations, and a lot of those places have their own individual courses on specific stuff as well.
No?
No?
Looks like, oh, perhaps you can list these courses and send them to, okay, so she's just asking if you can send me a list of those courses and I can send them out to the group.
100%. I will definitely send you an email on those courses.
Excellent. Any other questions for Kailha or comments? Or well, thank you, Kailha. This was great.
Thank you.
A good introduction and overview of the landscape, so that we can put into context some of the presentations coming up after you.
Thank you so much.